in startups like Uber in order to finance the U.S. economy. If this financing stopped, then the U.S. economy could face collapse. And this means that these young men could not afford their OnlyFans anymore, and this could lead to a revolution in the streets. So the consequences for America would be dire if America were to retreat from the Middle East.
I mean, it seems that the key part of all this sort of economic strangulation, if you like, by Iran is the Strait of Hormuz. We've already seen in the last few hours today that the successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, his son, has come out.
What you're about to watch turns into a far more uncomfortable exchange than Piers Morgan probably expected. During this interview, Professor Jang begins laying out a series of predictions and strategic conclusions that appear to genuinely throw the conversation off balance. As the discussion develops, you can almost sense the shift in the room. Instead of engaging deeply with the implications of what's being said, Piers increasingly seems to brush past or downplay the analysis being presented. What makes that reaction especially interesting is that Professor Jang is not some random commentator making reckless guesses. He has built a reputation on forecasting developments that many people dismissed at the time, only for those warnings to later prove accurate. That history gives extra weight to the points he raises here, which is why the tension in this conversation becomes so noticeable. We're going to play the exchange in full first, so you can hear every argument and every reaction for yourself without interruption. After that, I'll come back and break down the key moments, explain why this conversation became so revealing, and give my thoughts on why Piers seemed increasingly uncomfortable with where the discussion was heading. If you follow political debates, media narratives, and ideological conflicts shaping modern discourse, make sure you subscribe because there's a lot to unpack here.
Third prediction, that Iran ultimately will prevail in this war?
Right. So right now the United States and Iran are fighting a war of attrition. The United States is trying to degrade Iran's military capacity, and Iran is trying to strangle the world economy. And it turns out that Iran is putting a lot of pressure on the GCC. And I think at the end of the day, the United States will be compelled to send ground forces. Once the United States sends in ground forces, there's no turning back. It's all in. The sunk cost fallacy kicks in. It'll be another Vietnam for the United States because Iran is a mountain fortress. And the United States right now doesn't have the manpower, the manufacturing capacity, and the political will to fight a long war of attrition on the ground in Iran.
Right, so I think because of what you've said at the end there, it's highly unlikely that Trump would commit ground forces because he's always pledged not to, and I think he would see the inherent danger of that. So if he doesn't commit ground forces, how do you see this war playing out?
Well, right now, if Trump doesn't commit ground troops, he does have a variety of options. The first option is just to simply declare victory and call it a day. Unfortunately, the problem with that is that U.S. bases are still exposed, the GCC economies are still under pressure, the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and there are no signs that Iran is interested in peace negotiations. Iran feels as though it has the upper hand because it has the political will and the resources to draw this war out. Now, let's assume that Trump does withdraw from the Middle East. Then what happens is that the GCC nations of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE now are forced to pay a ransom to Iran because they supply the world with their oil for the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz, but in return they get food. So the GCC nations import anywhere from 80 to 90% of their food from overseas. And so basically the center of gravity shifts from the petrodollar to whatever financial system that Iran wants to focus on. And it could be BRICS, it could be gold, it could be anything. But remember, the problem with that is that the U.S. economy is a Ponzi scheme. is dependent on the GCC investing in AI and tech stocks, in startups like Uber, in order to finance the U.S. economy. If this financing stopped, then the U.S. economy could face collapse. And this means that these young men could not afford their OnlyFans anymore, and this could lead to a revolution in the streets. So the consequences for America would be dire if America were to retreat from the Middle East.
I mean, it seems that the key part of all this sort of economic strangulation, if you like, by Iran is the Strait of Hormuz. We've already seen in the last few hours today that the successor to Ayatollah Khamenei, his son, has come out. Apparently, we haven't seen him or heard from him directly, but there's a statement in which he talks about keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely. If that was to happen, what would be the consequences for the global economy, and how soon would we see those consequences?
Well, I mean, the consequences would be dire because cheap energy, cheap petroleum products are the very basis of the global modern economy. So it just wouldn't be jet fuel that would be affected. It would also be food, because remember, food is produced by fertilizer, which comes from the GCC, as well as sulfuric acid, which helps the process of semiconductor production. So artificial intelligence, food production, global travel are all dependent on products from the GCC. It's only been 2 weeks that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed for almost 2 weeks now, and already we're seeing high oil prices surpassing $100 a barrel. Iran says that they want to move it to $20 a barrel, which signals that they want the Strait of Hormuz closed for months. Now remember, even if Iran were to open up the Strait of Hormuz, it would take weeks before oil production continues. So I think for the global economy, I think we've reached the point of no return. And in the future, global economies have to commit to a bit of deindustrialization and even mercantilism in order to survive future shocks. So if you go to Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Thailand have already ordered the government workers to work from home in order to save fuel.
You've pointed out that the Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies, the GCC, as you've alluded to several times here, are structurally unusual states because they're propped up by oil, desalination. They don't have their own water supply naturally, and American protection. You say correctly, they were built in open desert with no food security, as you said, 80% imported, no water security, the desalination dependency, no geographic defenses, they're flat, exposed terrain, no demographic cohesion. In places like Dubai, for example, 90% of the population are expats, and no independent security architecture reliant on the US, who have bases obviously in many of the states there. If you put all this together, is what's happening now in terms of the tactics that Iran are deploying, including the threats to desalination, but also targeting, obviously, it's targeted hotels and airports and so on, going to the heart of what the states there would like to see as the future of their economy, which is tourism, sport, entertainment, clearly designed to scare people away from that. Is this now representing an existential threat, do you think, to the business model of the GCC states going forward?
Right. So the most vulnerable city and often the most glamorous city in the GCC is Dubai. And for many years, Dubai has been very successful in cultivating an image as the new city of London, as the new Hong Kong of the Middle East. And thousands of these millionaires flock to Dubai for the glamorous lifestyle as well as the tax-free aspect of the city. But the reality is that this was all premised on global peace, on Pax Americana, on the capacity of America to project power all around the world and provide security guarantees to the GCC. Now this aura of inevitability and invincibility of American empire has been shattered. And once an illusion is shattered, there's actually no coming back from this. And that's what people don't really appreciate about this war. This war is not just directed at Israel. This war is not directed just at the GCC and the illusion of American empire. This war is directed at American empire itself. And what people don't appreciate is the eschatological aspects of this war, in that Iran sees a moral duty, a moral imperative from God to destroy the great Satan, which is the American empire. And the base of the American empire, of course, is the global economy.
Right. At the heart and the head of the American economy is the President of the United States. You've argued that Trump is not the most powerful person in America, and you've inferred that actually the real power base is Israel. Explain that.
Right. So I actually don't say the real power base is Israel. What I say is that the real power base are a collection of secret societies that have an eschatological view of this war. And these secret societies include the Freemasons, which are now called the Rosicrucians and the Knights Templars. They include Jewish organizations called the Sephardim Frankists, who are embedded in religious movements called Shabbat Lubavitch. And then you have the Jesuits. You have a collection of secret societies. And they believe that a war in the Middle East would start a process that would culminate in the end times and the return of Jesus, the arrival of the Jewish Messiah, the building of a one world government. They have different eschatologies, but a lot of their time frames do align. So where they converge is that there has to be a war in the Middle East to kick things off. This war in the Middle East will lead to the defeat of the American empire, and this will lead to the culmination of the Greater Israel Project, where Israel is able to control the Middle East from the Nile to the Euphrates. Once the Greater Israel Project is in place, it will transform into the Pax Judaica, which is an AI surveillance state. This will eventually lead to the war of Gog and Magog, the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the building of the Third Temple, the return of the Jewish diaspora to Jerusalem, and the arrival of the Jewish Messiah or the Antichrist. So they have the scripted out. And unfortunately, a lot of world events are conforming to this script.
Right. I mean, a lot of people say a lot of what you've just said is a load of fantastical baloney and driven by anti-Semitic tropes. What do you say to that?
Look, I completely sympathize with this argument. 5 years ago, I would have said the same thing about this sort of argument and thinking. So what I do is predictive modeling, okay? Meaning that I'm going to throw some theories out there. And then based on these theories, I'm going to extrapolate into the future and see what the predictions are. If these predictions are correct, then my theories ought to have some legitimacy. Now, when I teach, I don't engage in historical analysis. I engage in speculative analysis. And so in 2024, 2 years ago, I did say that this war in Iran would happen, and I provided a lot of my analysis. And a part of my analysis that's very important is the eschatological analysis, meaning that Christian Zionists control the United States. There's a preacher called John Hagee who runs an organization called Christians United for Israel, which has about 7 million members. Christian Zionists are heavily embedded in the national security apparatus and in the Pentagon. There's reporting that U.S. commanders have told their troops that this is a war to bring back Jesus and to be not afraid. So that's my argument. Like, I don't want to believe this, but because this war in Iran is happening, I'm forced to conclude that some of my speculative analysis has validity. Otherwise,
I think to be honest, Yeah, I think the word speculation doesn't quite do it justice. I mean, look, there's no doubt your predictions so far have been proven to be uncannily accurate in relation to Trump winning and then going to war with Iran. But I think the idea that this is all part of a plot to bring back Jesus Christ, look, there might be some people out there that carry such a phrase. I think it's highly unlikely, unless any evidence emerges to the contrary, that they are current commanders in the United States military. But Professor Jang, you have a big following. Lots of people are interested in your predictive analysis, and it's good to have you on Uncensored. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Piers.
Watching that exchange back, the moment that stood out most was not even the prediction itself. It was the visible shift in how Piers Morgan responded once Professor Jang started moving toward conclusions that challenged the dominant narrative surrounding the conflict. The atmosphere changed from curiosity to resistance almost immediately, and it genuinely felt as though the discussion stopped being about examining the analysis and became more about containing it before it went too far. What makes that reaction so striking is that Professor Jang is not somebody known for throwing out random, inflammatory statements for attention. His reputation has been built around long-form analysis, pattern recognition, and strategic forecasting. Whether people agree with every conclusion he reaches or not, many viewers follow him, precisely because several of his previous assessments ended up aligning with later developments. That history naturally gives his words more weight when he makes another major prediction. The tension in the interview seemed to come from the implications of what he was saying rather than the mechanics of the argument itself. Once the conversation moved toward the possibility of American failure or strategic collapse, it almost felt like the discussion hit an invisible boundary. Instead of fully exploring the reasoning being presented, the focus shifted toward framing the analysis as controversial, dangerous, or potentially tied to familiar accusations and political labels. That pivot dramatically changed the tone of the interview. What also stood out was how quickly skepticism became dismissal. There is a major difference between critically challenging a guest and treating their entire framework as something that should be brushed aside before the audience even has time to seriously consider it. To many viewers, that distinction matters, especially when the guest in question is grounding arguments in historical trends, military analysis, geopolitical incentives, or publicly available data rather than emotional slogans. Part of the frustration people may feel watching this comes from the sense that the audience never got a full engagement with the argument itself. Instead of deeply interrogating the evidence or logic behind the prediction, the conversation drifted toward whether the analysis itself should even be entertained. That can leave viewers feeling as though an uncomfortable conclusion was being managed rather than debated. And that raises the bigger question underneath this entire exchange. When analysts begin predicting outcomes that challenge powerful political narratives, does the media instinctively become more defensive? That seemed to be the tension hanging over this interview from the moment Professor Yang pushed the conversation into territory that many mainstream discussions avoid. What really seems to be bothering a lot of people watching that exchange is the disconnect between the public messaging coming out of Washington and the growing number of analysts, journalists, and geopolitical observers openly questioning what success in this conflict would even look like anymore. That is the part that keeps getting brushed aside. If one side defines victory as total dominance, while the other side defines victory as simply remaining operational, continuing resistance, and surviving long enough to exhaust its opponent politically or economically, then the entire conversation about who is winning becomes far more complicated than the slogans people hear on television. That is why Professor Jang's argument appeared to resonate with so many viewers. He seemed to be talking about endurance, attrition, and long-term strategic cost rather than flashy declarations of military superiority. Historically, powerful states have struggled in conflicts where the opposing side does not need a traditional battlefield victory to claim success. Sometimes survival itself becomes the strategy, sometimes dragging a conflict out, increasing political pressure, or creating international fatigue becomes the battlefield. What made the interview uncomfortable to watch for some people was that, instead of seriously unpacking that possibility, the discussion appeared to move toward dismissing the premise altogether. And when audiences sense that a difficult argument is being waved away instead of fully examined, it naturally creates frustration and suspicion. People start wondering whether the reaction is about disproving the analysis or simply avoiding where the analysis could lead. Another thing that likely amplified the reaction is that audiences today are exposed to far more information sources than they were years ago. People are reading independent analysts, military observers, regional experts, leaked reports, foreign media coverage, and economic assessments in real time. Because of that, when mainstream interviewers appear overly dismissive of certain perspectives, viewers immediately notice the contrast between the official narrative and the broader debate happening elsewhere. At the same time, strong skepticism toward predictions in wartime interviews is not automatically unreasonable either. Media hosts often push back aggressively because wars are filled with propaganda, exaggerated claims, and emotionally charged narratives from every side. But there is still a difference between rigorous questioning and creating the impression that a guest's argument is being prematurely shut down before it can fully breathe. And honestly, that may be why this clip sparked such a strong reaction online. A lot of viewers did not walk away debating whether Professor Jang was correct or incorrect. They walked away debating whether he was genuinely allowed to fully make his case in the first place.